The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Palace, as King Edward VII stood at his study window, his weathered hands gripping the ornate curtains. At 68, the monarch's once proud shoulders now bore the weight of countless difficult decisions, but none had torn at his heart quite like this one. The document on his mahogany desk seemed to mock him with its formal language and royal seals, a decree that would sever the bonds he had spent decades building with his own children. The trouble had been brewing for months, ever since Queen Isabella's controversial policies had divided not just the nation, but the royal family itself. Edward's children from his first marriage, Prince William and Princess Catherine, had grown increasingly vocal in their opposition to their stepmother's influence. What had started as whispered concerns in palace corridors had erupted into public disagreements that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. Isabella entered the study without knocking, her emerald silk dress rustling against the marble floor. At 55, she maintained an elegant beauty that had captivated Edward 15 years earlier, shortly after his first wife's tragic death. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her green eyes held the determined gleam that had both attracted and occasionally frightened those around her. "The children have called another family meeting," she announced, her voice carrying the slight accent that betrayed her foreign birth. "William arrived an hour ago with that insufferable advisor of his, and Catherine is demanding to speak with you privately before the gathering." Edward turned from the window, his lined face showing the strain of recent weeks. The king had always prided himself on being a fair ruler, one who listened to all sides before making decisions, but the constant pressure from his children to remove Isabella from her position as his chief counselor had pushed him to a breaking point. "What exactly are they proposing this time?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Isabella moved closer, her heels clicking against the floor with practiced precision. "The same demands as before. They want me removed from all official duties, stripped of my title as senior royal advisor, and banned from participating in matters of state." Her voice remained steady, but Edward could see the hurt in her eyes. "They're threatening to withdraw their support for the monarchy entirely if you don't comply." The king felt his chest tighten. His son, William, now 38 and heir to the throne, had grown increasingly distant over the past year. The prince had initially welcomed Isabella into the family, understanding his father's need for companionship after the devastating loss of his mother. But as Isabella's influence grew and her progressive policies began reshaping palace traditions, William had become convinced that she was manipulating the king for her own gain. Princess Catherine, 5 years younger than her brother, had been even more direct in her opposition. The princess had publicly criticized several of Isabella's initiatives, including the controversial decision to open ancient royal gardens to the public and the restructuring of centuries-old court ceremonies. Catherine viewed these changes as an attack on royal heritage and had gathered a significant faction of nobles who shared her concerns. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of Sir Marcus Thornfield, the king's longtime private secretary. The elderly man had served the crown for over 4 decades and had become Edward's most trusted confidant. His usually impeccable appearance showed signs of stress, his silver hair slightly disheveled and his normally crisp uniform bearing wrinkles that spoke of a sleepless night. "Your Majesty," Sir Marcus began, his voice carrying the gravity of his message. "Prince William and Princess Catherine have issued an ultimatum. They've prepared a formal statement for release to the press if their demands are not met by noon today." Edward sank into his leather chair, the weight of his crown feeling heavier than ever. The statement would undoubtedly detail their grievances against Isabella and question her fitness to advise the crown. Such a public declaration from his own children would create a constitutional crisis that could destabilize the monarchy for generations. Isabella remained standing, her posture rigid with determination. "They're forcing you to choose between your duty as a king and your role as a father," she said quietly. "But perhaps it's time to show them that the crown cannot be held hostage by family drama." The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the study as Edward contemplated his options. The decision before him would define not only his reign, but the future of the royal family. His children had made their position clear: Isabella must go, or they would withdraw their support and potentially expose the monarchy to public scrutiny that could prove devastating. Sir Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest, Perhaps a private audience with the prince and princess might help resolve this matter without resorting to such drastic measures. I've tried reasoning with them, Edward replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. William believes Isabella is using her position to advance her own agenda, while Catherine sees her as a threat to royal tradition. They refuse to acknowledge any compromise. Isabella moved to stand beside the king's chair, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Edward, I've never asked you to choose between your family and me, but I won't stand by and watch them destroy everything we've worked to build. The reforms we've implemented have brought the monarchy closer to the people than it's been in centuries. The king looked up at his wife, seeing both her strength and vulnerability. Isabella's background as a diplomat from a smaller European nation had indeed brought fresh perspectives to the palace. Her initiatives had modernized many outdated practices and improved the crown's relationship with various international organizations. But her outsider status had also made her a convenient target for those resistant to change. The irony, Edward mused, is that they're demanding I act like an absolute monarch to remove the woman who has helped make me a more democratic ruler. The clock on the mantel chimed 10 o'clock, marking 2 hours until the children's deadline. Edward knew that whatever decision he made would have consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. The media had already begun speculating about tensions within the royal family, and any public split would fuel months of damaging coverage. Sir Marcus approached the desk cautiously. Your Majesty, the formal decree you requested has been prepared. If you sign it, Princess Catherine and Prince William will be stripped of their royal duties and titles, effectively removing them from the line of succession until further notice. Isabella gasped softly. Edward, surely there's another way. I never wanted you to destroy your relationship with your children. The king stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. They've made their choice, he said firmly. They've threatened the stability of the crown and demanded I abandon my wife and closest advisor. If they cannot support the monarchy as it stands, then they cannot serve it. He moved to his desk and picked up the ornate pen that had signed countless royal decrees throughout his reign. The document before him represented the most painful decision of his life, choosing his duty as king over his love as a father. But his children's ultimatum had left him no alternative. The crown must endure, he whispered, signing his name with steady strokes. Even if the family does not. As the ink dried on the decree, Edward felt something break inside him. The decision was made, and there would be no going back. By noon, his children would learn that their father had chosen the crown over their demands. The palace would announce that Prince William and Princess Catherine had been temporarily relieved of their royal duties due to their inability to support current monarchical policies. Isabella moved closer, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I'm so sorry it came to this, she whispered. Edward sealed the document and handed it to Sir Marcus, who accepted it with visible reluctance. See that this is delivered to the press secretary immediately, the king commanded. And arrange for private security to escort my children from the palace grounds once the announcement is made public. As Sir Marcus departed to execute the king's orders, Edward and Isabella stood together in the study that had witnessed countless moments of triumph and crisis throughout the centuries. Neither spoke, both understanding that their victory had come at an almost unbearable cost. The ancient palace walls seemed to absorb the weight of the moment, adding this latest chapter to their long history of royal drama and family tragedy. Outside, the morning had given way to an overcast sky, as if the heavens themselves mourned the fracturing of the royal family. In just 2 hours, the world would learn that King Edward VII had chosen duty over blood, crown over family. The decision would send shockwaves through the nation and beyond, setting in motion events that would test the very foundations of the monarchy. But for now, the king and queen stood in the quiet aftermath of their choice, knowing that their lives and the lives of everyone around them would never be the same again. The palace corridors buzzed with tension as word spread quickly among the staff about the king's unprecedented decision. Servants whispered in shadowed alcoves, while guards exchanged worried glances at their posts. The noon deadline had passed, and the royal decree had been delivered to both Prince William and Princess Catherine simultaneously, along with formal notices that their access to the palace would be restricted, effective immediately. Princess Catherine's reaction had been swift and fierce. Within minutes of receiving the decree, she had stormed through the palace halls, her usual composed demeanor shattered by rage and disbelief. Her heeled boots echoed against the marble floors as she made her way toward her father's study, flanked by two apologetic but determined security guards who had been instructed to ensure she gathered only personal belongings. 28 years of loyal service to this crown, Catherine declared loudly enough for anyone within earshot to hear. And this is how I'm repaid. Cast aside for a woman who has been here barely 15 years and has turned my father against his own blood. Prince William had taken the news with characteristic stoicism, but those close to him could see the fury burning behind his controlled exterior. He had immediately called an emergency meeting with his own advisors and legal team, exploring options that might challenge his father's authority. The prince's wife, Princess Elena, had been seen leaving the palace in tears, clutching their young daughter while refusing to speak to the assembled media that had already begun gathering at the gates. Queen Isabella found herself at the center of a storm she had never wanted to create. Despite her outward support for Edward's decision, the guilt weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had retreated to her private chambers, claiming she needed time to prepare for the inevitable media frenzy that would follow the public announcement. But in truth, she was struggling with the realization that her presence in the royal family had caused irreparable damage. The first signs that something was seriously wrong came during the afternoon meeting with the palace's senior staff. Isabella had always been punctual and well prepared for such gatherings, but she arrived nearly 20 minutes late, looking pale and slightly disoriented. Her normally perfect appearance showed subtle signs of distress. Her lipstick was slightly smudged, and her usually immaculate hair had a few strands out of place. Sir Marcus noticed immediately but chose not to comment, instead proceeding with the briefing about how to handle the media response to the family crisis. Isabella sat quietly throughout most of the meeting, occasionally pressing her fingertips to her temples, as if fighting off a headache. When asked directly about her preferred approach to addressing public concerns about her role in the family dispute, she seemed to struggle to find words. The public needs to understand that. Isabella paused, her green eyes appearing slightly unfocused. Excuse me, I seem to have lost my train of thought. Dr. Helena Ashworth, the palace physician who had attended the meeting to discuss the family's health during this stressful period, observed the Queen carefully. As a woman in her 60s who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, Dr. Ashworth had learned to recognize when someone was pushing themselves beyond their limits. Isabella's symptoms could easily be attributed to stress, but something about her pallor and subtle confusion raised medical concerns. The Queen managed to complete the meeting, though her contributions became increasingly brief and sometimes seemed disconnected from the topics being discussed. When the gathering ended, she rose from her chair with visible effort, steadying herself against the table for a moment before walking toward the door with measured, careful steps. King Edward, meanwhile, was dealing with the immediate political fallout from his decision. Prime Minister James Worthington had requested an emergency audience, bringing with him concerns from Parliament about the stability of the monarchy. The conversation had been tense, with Worthington warning that public support for the crown could be severely damaged if the family dispute continued to escalate. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister had said with diplomatic caution, the people have always seen your family as a symbol of unity and stability. This very public fracture threatens to undermine confidence in the institution itself. Edward had listened to these concerns with growing frustration, feeling trapped between his duty to protect his wife and his responsibility to preserve the monarchy. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier, and he found himself questioning whether he had made the right choice in cutting ties with his children. As evening approached, Isabella attempted to maintain her regular schedule, attending a small dinner reception for visiting diplomats from neighboring countries. The Queen had always excelled at such events, using her own diplomatic background to strengthen international relationships. But those who knew her well could see that she was struggling. Ambassador Maria Santos from the Republic of Valdres, who had worked closely with Isabella on several cultural exchange programs, noticed that the Queen seemed to lose focus mid-conversation. Isabella would begin discussing a topic with her usual intelligence and passion, only to trail off as if she had forgotten what she was saying. She also appeared to be having difficulty with names, addressing one ambassador by the wrong title, despite having worked with him for several years. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Santos had asked quietly during a private moment, "are you feeling quite well? You seem a bit tired tonight." Isabella had forced a smile, but her response lacked her typical warmth. "Just the stress of recent events, I'm sure. Nothing that a good night's rest won't cure." But even as she spoke, Isabella felt an odd sensation. As if the world around her was slightly off-kilter, colors seemed a little too bright, and sounds carried a strange echo that made it difficult to focus on conversations. She attributed these feelings to exhaustion and emotional strain, not wanting to add medical concerns to the crisis already engulfing the royal family. Dr. Ashworth, who had remained at the palace at the king's request, observed the queen throughout the evening reception. As a precautionary measure, she had spoken quietly with several staff members, asking them to watch for any signs that Isabella might need medical attention. The physician's instincts told her that the queen's symptoms went beyond simple stress. But without an opportunity to conduct a proper examination, she could only monitor and wait. The breaking point came near the end of the reception, as Isabella was saying farewell to the departing diplomats. She had been standing near the grand staircase, engaging in final pleasantries with Ambassador Santos, when she suddenly swayed slightly. The movement was subtle enough that only those standing very close noticed. But Dr. Ashworth saw the moment of unsteadiness, and immediately began moving closer. Isabella continued talking, but her words became increasingly difficult to follow. She seemed to be mixing languages, switching between English and her native tongue without apparent awareness. Ambassador Santos exchanged concerned glances with her aide, unsure whether to interrupt or continue the conversation. "The cultural programs will. Será importante que. Excuse me. I meant to say that the importance of maintaining." Isabella paused, blinking several times as if trying to clear her vision. "I'm sorry. I seem to be more tired than I realized." Dr. Ashworth reached the queen's side just as Isabella placed one hand against the wall for support. The physician's trained eye immediately recognized signs of neurological distress, the slight drooping of the queen's left eyelid, the barely perceptible weakness in her smile, and the way she seemed to be favoring her right side when standing. "Your Majesty," Dr. Ashworth said calmly but firmly, "I think it would be wise for you to rest now. Perhaps I could escort you to your chambers?" Isabella nodded gratefully, suddenly aware that something was very wrong with her body. The realization hit her with a wave of fear that she fought to keep hidden from the remaining guests. She had always prided herself on her strength and independence, but now she felt vulnerable and confused in a way that terrified her. As Dr. Ashworth guided the queen away from the reception area, Ambassador Santos quietly approached Sir Marcus, who had been overseeing the evening's events. The concern in the ambassador's voice was evident as she spoke in low tones about the queen's apparent confusion and difficulty with speech. Sir Marcus felt his stomach tighten with worry. After everything the royal family had endured that day, the last thing they needed was a medical emergency involving the queen. But as he watched Dr. Ashworth carefully help Isabella up the grand staircase, he realized that their crisis was about to take a dangerous new turn. The palace staff who witnessed the scene would later describe a sense of foreboding that settled over the ancient building like a heavy shroud. The queen's struggles were becoming more apparent with each step, and those who had served the royal family for years recognized that they were witnessing the beginning of something far more serious than stress or exhaustion. King Edward, still in his study dealing with the political aftermath of his decision about his children, remained unaware that his wife was experiencing what Dr. Ashworth increasingly suspected might be the early stages of a stroke. The physician's priority was getting the queen to her private chambers, where a proper medical assessment could be conducted away from public view. As they reached the top of the staircase, Isabella stumbled slightly, her coordination clearly compromised. Dr. Ashworth immediately called for assistance, and within moments, 2 trusted palace staff members appeared to help escort the queen to safety. The evening reception continued below, but word was already beginning to spread among the staff that something serious was happening with Queen Isabella. The irony was not lost on those who understood the full scope of the day's events. King Edward had chosen to protect his wife by cutting ties with his children, but now Isabella herself was facing a crisis that threatened to overshadow all the family drama that had consumed the palace. As Dr. Ashworth prepared to conduct her examination. She silently prayed that her fears about the Queen's condition would prove unfounded, knowing that the alternative could plunge the monarchy into chaos, far beyond anything they had yet experienced. Dr. Helena Ashworth had barely finished her preliminary examination when Queen Isabella's condition deteriorated rapidly. What had begun as subtle symptoms during the evening reception escalated into a full medical emergency within the private confines of the royal chambers. The Queen, who had been sitting on the edge of her bed while the doctor checked her vitals, suddenly lost consciousness and collapsed backward onto the ornate bedding. The physician immediately activated the palace emergency medical protocol, a system that had been in place for decades but rarely used for such serious circumstances. Within minutes, the Queen's chambers filled with medical personnel, monitoring equipment, and the controlled chaos of a life-threatening situation being managed within the ancient walls of Ravenshollow Palace. Sir Marcus received the urgent call while still managing the diplomatic aftermath of the evening's reception. The elderly secretary's face went ashen as he listened to Dr. Ashworth's clinical but alarming report. A suspected stroke affecting Queen Isabella required immediate advanced medical intervention that exceeded the palace's capabilities. An ambulance would need to be called, which meant the medical emergency could no longer be kept private. Notify His Majesty immediately, Sir Marcus instructed the nearest aide, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, and contact the head of palace security. We need to prepare for media containment and manage the situation with absolute discretion until we understand the full scope of the Queen's condition. King Edward was in the middle of reviewing legal documents related to his children's changed status when the urgent knock came at his study door. The moment he saw Sir Marcus's expression, he knew something catastrophic had occurred. The secretary's usual diplomatic composure had given way to barely controlled panic, and his hands trembled slightly as he delivered the devastating news. Isabella, Edward's voice broke as he processed the information. How serious is it? Dr. Ashworth believes it may be a significant stroke, Your Majesty. The Queen has lost consciousness and requires immediate transport to Royal General Hospital for emergency treatment. The advanced neurological unit there is her best hope for recovery. The king rose from his chair, with surprising speed for a man of his age, his mind racing between personal fear for his wife and the institutional implications of the crisis. A serious medical emergency involving the Queen, coming just hours after his public break with his children, would create a media storm of unprecedented proportions. As Edward rushed through the palace corridors toward Isabella's chambers, he encountered the first signs of the controlled panic that was beginning to spread throughout the building. Staff members moved with urgent purpose, their usual formal demeanor replaced by barely contained anxiety. The Queen's sudden collapse had transformed the palace from a place of political crisis into a medical emergency zone. Dr. Ashworth met the king outside Isabella's chambers, her professional manner unable to fully mask her grave concerns. Your Majesty, the Queen's condition is critical. She's suffered what appears to be a major stroke affecting the left side of her brain. We've stabilized her for transport, but she needs immediate surgery to remove a blood clot that's blocking circulation to critical areas. Edward felt his knees weaken as the reality of the situation hit him. Just hours earlier, he had chosen to protect Isabella by severing ties with his children. Now she lay unconscious, fighting for her life, while he faced the possibility of losing the woman he had defied his own family to defend. Can I see her? He asked quietly. Dr. Ashworth nodded solemnly. Briefly. The paramedics are preparing for transport now. Edward entered the chamber to find Isabella connected to multiple monitoring devices, her usually vibrant complexion pale and lifeless. The woman who had stood by his side that morning, encouraging him to make the difficult decision about his children, now lay motionless, her breathing supported by machinery that filled the room with rhythmic electronic sounds. He took her hand in his, feeling how cold her fingers had become. I'm so sorry, he whispered, unsure whether he was apologizing for the stress that may have contributed to her collapse, or for the impossible choices that had led them to this moment. The sound of approaching sirens outside the palace walls announced that the medical emergency could no longer be contained within the building. Palace security had done their best to coordinate with local authorities to minimize media exposure, but the arrival of multiple ambulances and emergency vehicles would inevitably attract attention. Sir Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face reflecting the gravity of their situation. "Your Majesty. The media has already begun gathering at the gates. We need to prepare a statement about the Queen's condition, and—" He hesitated before continuing. "We should consider whether to contact Prince William and Princess Catherine." Edward's jaw tightened as he realized the horrible irony of their circumstances. The children he had banished just hours earlier would learn about their stepmother's critical condition through news reports unless he reached out to them directly. Despite their bitter disagreements, they deserved to know what was happening, especially if Isabella's condition proved fatal. "Contact them," Edward said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion and regret. Tell them the Queen is gravely ill, and that their presence at the hospital would be appropriate." As the paramedics prepared to transport Isabella to Royal General Hospital, the palace transformed into a crisis management center. Communications specialists worked frantically to craft statements that would inform the public about the Queen's condition, without revealing the full extent of the political turmoil that had preceded her collapse. Prime Minister Worthington arrived at the palace within the hour, bringing with him constitutional lawyers and government officials who needed to discuss the implications of the Queen's incapacitation. The monarchy's stability, already shaken by the family disputes, now faced questions about succession and governance that no one had expected to address so suddenly. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said carefully, "the nation needs to see that the crown remains strong during this crisis. Your presence at the Queen's bedside is important, but we also need to ensure continuity of royal duties." Edward barely heard the political concerns being raised around him. His focus remained entirely on Isabella, and the possibility that his decision to choose duty over family had contributed to the stress that may have caused her stroke. The guilt was overwhelming, made worse by the realization that he might lose her just as he had lost his children. The drive to Royal General Hospital felt like the longest journey of Edward's life. Accompanied by security personnel and palace officials, he watched the city pass by in a blur of flashing lights and media vehicles that had quickly mobilized to cover the developing story. News broadcasts were already speculating about the Queen's condition and its potential impact on the monarchy's future. At the hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief of neurosurgery, met with the king to explain the complex procedure Isabella would need to survive. The blood clot affecting her brain required immediate surgical intervention, but the operation carried significant risks, including the possibility of permanent cognitive impairment or paralysis. "We'll do everything possible to minimize damage," Dr. Chen assured him, "but strokes of this severity can have lasting effects. Even with successful surgery, the Queen may face a long recovery period with uncertain outcomes." As Isabella was taken into surgery, Edward found himself alone in a private waiting room, surrounded by the institutional quiet of a hospital at night. For the first time in decades, he felt truly powerless. The crown had always provided him with resources and authority to address any crisis, but medical emergencies respected no royal privilege. The first call came from Prince William just after midnight. The heir to the throne's voice carried a mixture of concern and residual anger as he spoke to his father for the first time since receiving his banishment decree. "How serious is her condition?" William asked, his royal training keeping his tone respectful despite their recent conflict. "Very serious," Edward replied honestly. "She may not survive the surgery, I thought. I thought you should know." There was a long pause before William responded. "We're driving to the hospital now. Catherine is with me. Whatever our disagreements about palace policy, we wouldn't want Isabella to face this alone." The arrival of his children at Royal General Hospital created a surreal scene in the surgical waiting area. Prince William and Princess Catherine entered with their security details, their faces showing the strain of the day's emotional upheaval. The siblings who had been formally banished from royal duties just hours earlier now found themselves reunited with their father in the most unlikely circumstances. Catherine approached first, her earlier fury replaced by genuine concern. "How long has she been in surgery?" she asked quietly. 3 hours, Edward replied, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. Dr. Chen said it could take several more hours to remove all the clots. The family sat together in awkward silence, the weight of their morning's conflict hanging between them like an unspoken accusation. Isabella's life-threatening crisis had forced them into proximity, but it had not erased the fundamental disagreements that had torn them apart. William finally broke the silence. "Father, I know we've had serious differences about Isabella's role in the monarchy. But seeing you now, I never wanted this to happen to her, or to you." Edward looked at his son with eyes that held both gratitude and profound sadness. "Your opposition to her policies may have had merit," he admitted quietly, "but I couldn't allow you to force me to abandon my wife. The crown cannot be held hostage by ultimatums, even from family." Princess Catherine shifted in her hospital chair, struggling with her own complex emotions. "We were trying to protect the monarchy," she said defensively. "Isabella's changes were happening too quickly, without proper consultation or consideration of traditions that have served the crown for centuries. And I was trying to protect my marriage," Edward replied. "Perhaps we all could have found a better way to handle our concerns without creating such a public crisis." As dawn approached, Dr. Chen emerged from the surgical suite with cautious optimism. The operation had been successful in removing the major blood clots. But Isabella remained in critical condition. The next 48 hours would determine whether she had suffered permanent brain damage and what her prospects for recovery might be. "She's stable for now," Dr. Chen explained to the assembled royal family. "But stroke recovery is unpredictable. She may face challenges with speech, mobility, or cognitive function. We'll know more as she begins to regain consciousness over the next few days." The news forced Edward to confront a new reality. Even if Isabella survived, she might never again be the strong, influential advisor who had helped reshape his approach to monarchy. The woman he had chosen to protect by banishing his children could emerge from this crisis fundamentally changed, requiring care rather than offering counsel. Looking at his children, who had maintained their vigil throughout the night despite their formal banishment, Edward realized that the Queen's medical emergency had created an opportunity for reconciliation that might not have existed otherwise. The crisis had reminded all of them that family bonds transcended political disagreements, and that the monarchy's strength came not from rigid adherence to protocol but from the human connections that sustained it through difficult times. As Isabella was moved to intensive care, surrounded by the most advanced medical equipment the hospital could provide, the royal family faced an uncertain future together. The morning's painful decisions about duty versus family seemed less clear-cut in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital corridor, where life and death mattered more than political positions or ceremonial protocols. The Queen's sudden collapse had indeed left the palace in panic, but it had also created an unexpected path toward healing the wounds that had threatened to destroy the royal family forever.